I think I know all of you except our main campus person. Now, I'm Kristin, and I bet you're a quilter, right?
I am.
I'm glad you came. This evening I'm going to talk about the quilts of Wales. And in doing that, I'm going to talk about a little bit about Wales, a little bit about the weather in Wales, a little bit about sheep, and wool production, but mostly about quilts and the quilters who made them. So my interest in Welsh quilts actually came from two directions. I lived very happily in a little village called Llanfihangeli-Pwll.
Say it again, Kristin. Say it again.
Llanfihangeli-Pwll. It was anglicized, it was Mickleston Le Pit. Meaning there was a depression. It wasn't the pits. So I lived there. It was near Cardiff. It was in South Wales. And I was there for 6 years, from 1990 till 96. I was married to an American who had a small business in Cardiff, manufacturing nails and staples. Because there are a lot of fences in Wales, because the holdings are very small, and for any kind of privacy, they built fences between all the row houses. During that time, I learned a whole lot about Wales, and I made great Welsh friends who often came to visit me in the 10 years or so after I came back. But I had no interest in quilting. I hadn't quilted before, but all in all, I absolutely loved my experience there. So I lived in Wales, so that was the first connection. But it was after I moved back that a Welsh friend sent me a card. Well, first of all, here's the cottage where I lived.
Wow.
In the right-hand side. That was 3 cottages together. And it was charming. It was Victorian, built probably in the late 1800s. And there was a little church in our village that was from the 1100s. So when I got back, I got this card from my friend Jane Jenkins, and it piqued my interest, as it would. And it was titled, "Lassie Cow Keeping Warm Under a Heavy Cotton Strippy Welsh Quilt." And they call it strippy because it's in strips, it's made in strips. So there's a couple, a farmer and his wife, in front of their cottage with Lassie. That was in 2012, and my friend had heard a talk by a woman named Jen Jones. And she was an avid collector of Welsh quilts. It turned out she, at the time, in 2012, confessed to owning 350 vintage Welsh quilts, like Strippy the Cow, Lassie the Cow. So that was one of the things that piqued my interest too. And by that time, I had decided I wanted to start quilting. And my cousin's wife, Trish Koza, helped me start. So that was it. My friend who sent me the card of Lassie also said, why don't we go visit that museum of, or it was called the Welsh Quilt Center, next trip back. So that was the plan for 2015. So now I'm going to give you just a little background on Wales, very brief, its sheep, wool production, etc. So this is a schematic of the UK, and they have sized out the different portions relative to states in the US. So as you can see, Scotland is about the size of Minnesota. Wales is the chartreuse one at the bottom left, and it's about the size of Iowa. Now, Ireland itself is not on this map because it's not part of the UK, but Northern Ireland is that West Virginia, the light yellow. Wales is a tiny country, and it was always a pretty poor country, kind of under the thumb of the English. It has a similar population to Iowa. It's about 3 million people, and it borders England to the east. So England is all of that double part underneath Minnesota. The sea surrounds the northern, western, and southern borders of Wales. And the thing that I thought was remarkable, somebody told me this one time, they said, you know, you can never get any farther from the sea when you're in Wales than 75 miles. And I thought, man, being a USA girl from right down smack in the middle of Iowa, in the middle of the US, it was like, seriously? But that was the case. This is a weather map that I just took. I took a photo of it when I was looking at it online one time. I was thinking about going, and I thought, well, what's the weather going to be like? This is pretty much what it was like at the time. The little white arrows show the rain pattern coming down. And the tan lump on the left is Ireland, the lower part. The upper part is Northern Ireland, and then you see it in that same shape. That's the UK. So it rains a whole lot. And one of the expressions that they use in the morning, because oftentimes it's more like a mist than anything else. And on mornings like that, you could hardly even feel it, but it made your skin feel so soft. And that's what they call it, a soft morning. As a result of all that moisture, these bluebell woods bloomed like crazy every spring, and they were absolutely glorious. They were all over in woods all over. And also it produced the greenest, lushest farm fields with lots of fodder for sheep, who are, of course, well suited with their kind of oily, thick wool coat to protect themselves from the wet. This is a picture above Barmouth Harbour in northwest Wales, North Wales, really. And I just am going to show you a few pictures just to illustrate that sheep are everywhere. So this was kind of a rough mountain, and on over in that kind of white abyss, that's the sea. And you can see the stone walls, which were often in the northern part. And then those white things are sheep. And then this is a composite. Again, the upper left one shows a view of the town of Barmouth and the harbor is detailed in the lower right. But again, up near those craggy rocks, sheep. My friend Emily Martin came to visit about 5 times while I lived in Wales, and she's an artist. And the first time she came, she brought 2 of those composition books that are red, or that are white and black. You know, they have kind of the dampened cover. She had taken them apart and put them back together with 2 pages of lined paper, and then a blank sheet behind it. And the plan was, along with the little Curious George pencil case that had 5 different colored pencils, an eraser, a little ruler, and a black pen, that we were to keep the journal of every day that she was visiting, and we were to write about the day and then draw a picture of the day. Well, after the first day, I said, Emily, we're going to have to exchange these every day. It's the only way we're going to keep on task. And so we did. So I have 2 books that are each half and half. And this is from one of the trips she made. It's not from Wales, but there's a really funny story that goes along with it. This was before cell phones, so that's a camera there set with a timer, and there we are. We've arrived at the Lath Hill Hotel in the Peak District. And again, all the stone walls, cat on the roof, and sheep everywhere. And it reminds me, when I look at it, some friends were visiting, Jane McCune and Bob Watchell. And Jane said to me at dinner, she said, you know, when we arrived at that B&B, it was dark, and we thought there were boulders in the field. And in the morning, the boulders had moved, and we realized they were sheep. And I said, yeah, that's right. So I'm going to leave that on just for a minute or 2. Wikipedia, here's some info now. Wikipedia states that in 1660, the wool industry accounted for 2/3 of Wales' economy. 3.5 centuries later, in 2011, sheep farming accounted for 80% of agriculture in Wales. And by 2017, there were more than 10 million sheep in Wales. over 3 times the number of humans. So of course, I'm thinking, well, that's a lot like pigs in Iowa. So there were and are a lot of sheep in Wales. And so because of that, historically, wool was always more accessible and far cheaper than cotton, especially with the quilts I'll be showing you. Quilting goes back as early as the 17th and 18th centuries in Wales, but mostly quilted items were for warmth. Undergarments, like this quilted petticoat or skirt under a skirt. And, but more commonly they were for military, under armor. And it also was utilized for really rough utilitarian bed coverings, basically for warmth. Often made from bits of old worsted wool, blankets. As I said, they were a poor country. They reused a lot of stuff. It was reused, recycled. Sarah, you would like that? Reuse, recycle. So, I know that not all of you quilt, so just for a second, I'm going to just explain the 3 layers of a quilt. In a quilt, or in this piece, you would have the top layer, which is the blue in this case. And then you would have a layer of what we call batting. They call it wadding. Could be anything, but it's that provides the warmth. And then you have a bottom layer, which again here is the brown red. And quilting refers to the drawing of a needle back and forth, up and down through those 3 layers to keep the layers together. And often in a very intricate pattern on the fabric. So that's what you're going to see, is that intricate pattern. The largest output of Welsh quilting began in the mid-19th century, about 1850s, and continued for about 100 years until 1940. And according to Mary Jenkins and Claire Claridge, who wrote this book, Making Welsh Quilts, they divide quilts, those quilts, into 3 categories, 3 main categories. The first is what they call the woolen quilts, or the Welsh often call them flannel. They refer to them as flannel quilts. And these are made of wool. They have probably a wool batting, and they're often this very geometric pattern and design, and often in red and black. The second category is the cotton multi-fabric quilts, like what we would call patchwork quilts. This one, when I saw it, I was just, to use a British phrase, gobsmacked. I couldn't believe, how many pieces are in that. There must be thousands. And so anyway, I included that in this talk tonight. There's a detail of it. And it was probably done from scraps. And then this is the end of the bed that was with it. And you can see some of the patterns, some of the things coming up that are frequent, like hearts especially, are frequent quilting designs. This is the woman who made that quilt. Her name is Sarah Jane Morgan. And incredible. And if you look really closely, you can see Welsh. It's the bottom part of that, which I would not ever in the world try to pronounce, except for the name of the village. This is another pieced quilt, but it's much more simplistic in the whole thing. And you can see it's not really a symmetrical pattern, and this just highlights the fact that they used what they had, and when they ran out of color, they just would use another color, sort of in the same place. And then this is the third category. This is what they call the whole cloth cotton sateen quilts. I can never decide if these are my favorite or the wool ones from the first, but they're definitely 2 of my favorite. These are, well, these were the featured quilts. These were, and the woolen ones in the 2 exhibits I went to see. So I'll talk more about these later, but there's just a couple more later on. So in 2016, off we went, and this is another one of the drawings. This is, Wales is hilly, and so these roads kind of go around the hills and they meander this way and that. And Lampeter is in mid-Wales, and we were driving from Cardiff in South Wales, and it's a long and winding road, sometimes on very narrow roads. And my husband used to say that, he said, oh my God, the roads here are like somebody dropped a pot of cooked and drained spaghetti on the floor, and that's what the roads look like. They're just like snakes all over. So after a long drive, we got to Lampeter, and it was a kind of a cold and rainy day. But Lampeter is a very interesting town. It's a charming market town, and it has nice shops and restaurants. And these rows of rainbow-colored homes. And the homes, most of the homes in a city center in Wales are like this. They're like row houses, but the rows aren't on a grid system. They meander as well. So we found a tea shop immediately, because the friend I went with was Welsh, and it was like, we must have tea now. And with that, we had a slice of something called bar brief, which is it's a Welsh bread, like a loaf bread with dark, and it's spicy and has raisins and stuff, and it was delicious. Right next to the tea shop was this building, which is the old town hall. So it was in city center, and it was this town hall that Jen Jones, the woman with the 350 quilts, and her husband Roger Clive Powell purchased and then renovated into what is now the Welsh Quilt Center. And they mount one main exhibition of quilts per year, mostly from Jen's large collection, but also additional pieces from other sources. And they also utilize really interesting combinations of utilitarian items like bed frames or traditional Welsh costumes or Welsh hats, paintings, and other pertinent items that they feel are nice associations with the theme of their exhibit. So in 2016, this is the exhibit catalog for that exhibit that we went to see. And it was called Unforgettable. And it was the woolen quilts. This was what you saw when you walked in the door with that neon sign. And it was a very high ceilinged room, probably about 4 times the size of this room. And the woman who was the exhibit designer was an interesting woman. Her name was Gwendolyn Ashley. And she wrote that she attempted to give the viewer a sense of the small scale and the dark, cramped conditions that the women would have worked in at this time. So although this house represents that, if the houses were not that small, but and there would have been a quilter, and they did those coiled things around their hats, and she's in pretty typical garb with a shawl, and then you can see on her quilt rack she has some quilts hanging there. I don't know her name. They didn't identify her. So let's see. These were other things that were in this exhibit. These were actual hats the women used to wear. And this was what they dressed like. They dressed in costumes, daily costumes, such as this, with a shawl, dark color, but they often used red and black. Like these are 2 pieces of wool from a mill in West Wales, where I bought them. But that would be typical, that red and black. And then a really clever thing that they did, which I thought was wonderful, was Gwendolyn had someone construct a mobile out of representations of the black hats. And it was lovely, just hanging from the ceiling. And again, the shadows cast from it were really interesting. The thing that I found remarkable about this is these quilts would have been designed and made to be bed coverings. They were for warmth. And I think that the quilters would have just laughed at the thought of them being put on a wall in a museum. But I found them hung as art. The exuberance and the confidence and the brilliance of the colors and the designs were so impressive. It was just overwhelming to see them all surrounded in this room. So I'm just going to flip through several of them because I took close-ups and some not. But these woolen quilts, utilitarian woolen quilts, were the earliest of the two that I'm speaking of. And they were made before cotton became really affordable, but wool, again, was very abundant. They were often put together with scraps from clothing or bits of an old blanket that could be saved and reused in another quilt, because the blankets would have been full color. Dorothy Osler. Oh, here's a very unusual one in that it was kind of orange and purplish black, but that was a one of a kind. Most of them were the black and white. Dorothy Osler wrote in a June-July 2010 issue of Quilter's Newsletter that the quilter often had to quilt through a wool top or wool back and a thick batting of either carded wool, several layers of wool cloth, or even an old quilt. But in spite of this thickness, many of these old wool quilts are covered in really complex quilting designs. And you can't see them very well here, but I've got this close up. You can see. And quilting through that didn't allow for small, neat stitches. I know quilters now, hand quilters, strive for over 7 stitches per inch, and a lot of them succeed up to 10. I mean, tiny little stitches. You know, their hands work like this, back and forth. When you looked at these closely, there were maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 to the inch, just because they always used a tough linen thread, which is often brown in color. Now, another thing that Dorothy Osler said, which I think is, it's a little heady for this talk, but she said, the thickness of the quilts produces a textural quality when quilted that also defines this Welsh quilt genre. The quilting design is not a subsidiary component of the surface design, but a subtle yet essential element. And I can see that. To my mind, everything about Welsh quilts is the quilting. The color is secondary to it, and when we get to the other ones, the color is secondary to it. It's the quilting. Jenkins and Claridge said that before these quilts were rediscovered as national treasures, and here are more of them, collectors would often find them relegated to dog beds or out in the country having covered vegetables for a frost, to protect them from frost. Or they would protect a mattress from the box springs. Or people would just stow them away in barns as heavy old things. Curious. They also called them the Cinderella quilts because literally they had been left out in the cold. And now they're exhibited in museums. So I think it's a very apt comment. Yeah, each one different. They did not use patterns in the same way that we use patterns today. They would just make it up as they went. They had templates for some things, like they probably had a good square that they knew how to make. This one was remarkable. It had kind of a ribbon edge, but these looked like propellers to me. And again, you can see how this was just using what they had. The designs are basically the same in all of them, but with a different color. This one is a lovely one. And here, this again shows that they used what they had. When they ran out of a color, they just hunted. And, I think it makes them all the more interesting looking. And a few more. And that's a really interesting one too. Jen Jones, in her book, Welsh Quilts, says that around 1840, roller printed cotton fabrics became widely available and cotton quilt production soared. So that was around 1840. And at the same time, there was a resurgence in the output of Welsh flannel. And some of the most exciting of the Welsh quilts in that Welsh flannel ever made resulted from the abundance of this wonderful indigenous material in these bold colors: reds, blacks, blues, and a lesser extent greens. And the result of that Welsh flannel was these large-scale geometric patchworks which used squares, triangles, stripes, and bars. And those are the wool quilts we just saw. I got to meet Jen Jones. She happened to be at the museum or the center the day I was there. So I said, "May I take a picture of you?" She said, "Sure." So the next exhibit that I saw was of the whole cloth quilts, and that's what you see in blue in the background of this exhibit flyer. This exhibit was in 2015, and it was called the Welsh Quilt Party. And this whole cloth quilt style dominated the quilt scene between about 1880 and 1940, according to Jen Jones. And they're the whole cloth sateen on the front. And here you see one front, which is the pink one in the right-hand side. But the backs of these were whole cloth, usually a floral fabric. So that's what you're seeing from this angle. The ones hanging, all the others on display are the backs of the quilt. And there's an interesting story about that too, because it was the sateen whole cloth side that they would turn out so you could see it on a bed when the GP was coming or a distant relative was coming. That was the posh bit. But functionally, they would keep the other side out. I think that these are truly spectacular because of the quilting and how you can see it. And it's because of the sheen, number one. But it's also because it's a single color. And when I look at them, I mean, the quilting is similar, but it's more intense here, and it's a finer quilt because they didn't have all the thickness to go through. And even though the patterns are similar, the quilting patterns are similar on these to the wool ones. With the wool ones, I'm so gobsmacked by the black and by the geometric patterns that I'm not looking at the pattern of the quilting as much as I am on the whole cloth. So that's kind of, there's a real close-up. And you begin to see the designs that they use in them. They use hearts, spirals, they use some leaf-like things, and it's very dense quilting. This is an example of, this is just a part of one of the quilting frames that they would quilt on. And it was two long pieces of wood with a brace across the two. And they would rotate so that you could roll the work you've done onto one side and new stuff off the other. This one was just stunning. It had these puffed little pointy edges. So it was these beautifully executed sateen whole cloth quilts that formed the basis of a thriving cottage industry in Wales from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. And I'm going to show you just a few more. These are some just small examples of some of them that was in another part of the museum. But you can see the themes and the images that they use. And they use them over and over. Both Mary Jenkins and Claire Claridge's book and Jen Jones in Welsh Quilts, talk about this Rural Industries Bureau, which in 1928, which would be between the wars, between World War I and II, they initiated a program, this Rural Industries Bureau, which was designed to stimulate craft industries in parts of Wales where borderline poverty prevailed as the Depression took its toll. Wales was never a rich country, but the Depression was especially hard on them. Jen Jones writes, the more expert rural quilters, particularly those in the Welsh valleys, were encouraged to perfect their techniques and refine their workmanship. They were financially assisted in obtaining the fabric and filling, but the Bureau didn't pay for the finished product. It instead placed them with commercial outlets and galleries, and then they in turn found other outlets for them in Cardiff, which is the capital city of Wales, and in London. And the quilts produced during this period were some of the finest ever made in Wales. They were they were less gross than the wool ones. Very, very fine, very slick. The standards had to be to the highest. And they would go into the best hotels, the Grosvenor, the Dorchester. They were in Claridge's, and some of the aristocracy even bought them, English and Welsh, and the royals even owned some of them. But with the onset of World War II, the Bureau closed down and the program ground to a halt. And I wondered if perhaps the women needed to grow vegetables instead for the men, for the men doing war. So now to the lady with the basket. In a further explanation of the quilters themselves, Jen Jones writes, the cozy notion of a sewing bee, which you read about in some old books, where ladies of the community got together in a home to quilt and gossip, was not a Welsh concept. Although some quilts were made in homes by the women of the household or in groups such as the Women's Institute, the vast majority were sewn by professional seamstresses and quilters. Quilt making was a paid occupation. It was not a hobby. It was one of the few available means by which a Welsh woman could earn a living. And it offered a livelihood to many miners' widows because the valleys in these parts of South Wales and Mid Wales and North Wales, they were full of mines. They were copper mines, they were slate mines, they were coal mines. And there were many, many accidents, which would have left a widow with maybe 3 or 4 kids to support in addition to herself. So they had 3 choices of what they could do. Literally, no pensions, nothing like that, of course. They could do domestic work if there was a rich family that was hiring. They could become prostitutes, or they could pick up a needle and thread. And quilting was by far the means by which widows could remain at home and still eke out a respectable livelihood. Spinsters, also of slender means, were frequently suggested. It was frequently suggested that they turn to sewing and quilting as a means to support themselves. But make no mistake, it was not a hobby, it was a job. And I love this. Jen Jones writes about a woman named Nancy Lewis, and she lived in Llandero. It says, Miss Nancy Lewis devoted approximately 12 hours out of every 24 to sewing and quilting. She suffered from excruciatingly severe migraines, but she couldn't allow them to deter her from her task. She merely wound a wet handkerchief around her head and persevered. Her quilts were of the finest quality and greatly in demand, so she made money doing this. Every household aspired to have one of her specials, and her dowry quilts were a prerequisite for every bride to be's bottom drawer. But suddenly, at the age of 60, Nancy, the clever wench, meets a widower and falls in love, promptly marries him, never picks up a needle again, and never has another migraine. This is a pair that was probably the master quilter and her apprentice. And Jones writes in her book, Welsh Quilts, about how the quilter sewed alone or with an apprentice who was commonly the daughter of a local family willing to pay up to £2, which is about $3 now, for her to train under a professional. After a year, she would become proficient and she would be able to do this trade on her own. And it was a trade that was deemed appropriate for a young woman of no great expectations. Some quilters were also itinerants, and they would journey from farm to farm. And the farms were fairly remote. And they would stay about 2 weeks, and they would leave about $1.50 richer. And the quilter provided nothing but her expertise and her skills. And because these were remote, it was remarked when she was writing about this, that this was often anticipated a lot by both the farmer's wife and the quilters, because they got this social time that otherwise they would not have had. These are pictures that I just happened to find of the Museum of Welsh Life, which was in St. Fag, very near Cardiff. It was a place I used to take visitors all the time. It was fascinating. These were pictures I saw there that were from an exhibit that had been in 1951. And they must have been featuring the whole cloth quilts, because these are photos of women actually demonstrating and working on them. And I put this in because it again shows the whole of that quilt. But there you can see she has her templates just lying there, and they use that frame horizontally, with one hand up and one hand under. And there's a paisley. It was just amazing. Here are two of them together. And again, you can see they're working on the sateen, you can tell. And this lady has lots of apparatus. She has circles and daisies and paisley and rulers. According to Martha Waterman, in her article, and she's down there, the yellow one, Quilts of Wales, it was in Piecework in January, February 98. Welsh quilting designs are dense, lively, and complex in nature, and I hope I've shown you that. Similarly to historian Nora Chadwick's description of the Celtic art style, the features of Welsh quilts are love of decoration and ornament, repetition of motif, I love this one, horror of empty space, and extreme skill in adapting its patterns to the space to be filled. And here are some, this is again from Martha Waterman, who is a current day person. These are some of the designs that are featured. She says the design combines, and this you kind of saw in the whole cloth quilts, there's always a center medallion motif. So there's either a square or a circle in the center. There are also corner motifs, and then there are one or more borders around. And those boundaries are filled with triangles, squares, half circles, and spirals. And some are drawn to represent natural forms like leaves and the like. And this one is a good example of just the edge of a quilt that again uses the spirals that almost look like ferns, the beginning of a fern, and more spirals. Spiral designs. And she also says that, you know, all of those things are included, hearts, the leaf motifs, but it is spiral with its echoes of the ancient rock formations and carvings that are found in North Wales. That's perhaps the most characteristic of the Welsh quilting patterns. And I would say it's the signature of the Welsh quilt. So, one last thing, and that is just to repeat that these are not standardized patterns. They worked among themselves. And you're free to take a look at all these books, and I'm pleased to say that I am going back to Wales in October, and I'm going to visit the Welsh Quilt Center again. So There may be part 2. So, thank you. Any questions, anybody? Yes,
How the red and black intrigued me, and I'm wondering if what might have been the influence that created that combination for them.
well, it's a curious question, and I have just a little sheet about that, just in case it came up. The far book over there is something that someone wrote and said, these Welsh quilts, Amish quilts, is there a connection or was it coincidence? And how it was described. There was an exhibit at the Welsh, I keep stumbling on the name, the Welsh Quilt Center, that was called Amish Quilts and the Welsh Connection. And this was back in 2012. It was called A Quilted Bridge. And it was interesting because it showed both side by side. There is a big collection in the American Museum in Bath of Amish quilts. And then, of course, the museum center had a lot of the others. So side by side they hung them. And I think it would be up to all of us as viewers to see what we thought. But the point that was made was that these two communities, the Welsh and the Amish, were both independent, non-conformist, plain living people. And they both arrived in America on immigrant ships at much the same time. During the mid-1800s, they settled, and those who were in Pennsylvania and Ohio became neighbors. So the question was, and I think still is, were the similarities in their designs due to coincidence, influence, or what? Now, Dorothy Osler thinks it was influence. So, if that answers your question.
What did they use for dyes on that wool?
Natural dyes. Early on, natural dyes. And then commercial dyes came into play.
I was going to ask the same question about dye. Did they dye their own wool traditionally?
I don't know if they did or not, or if there were markets that sold fabric. I don't know that. But they would have used a natural dye. Jane?
I have a comment and a question. It seems like there must be mathematics involved in this to get it to work out right and not end up with, half the pattern in the wrong place or something.
I don't know. I mean, all I know, and you can answer with me, back there is another quilter. Sometimes when you create your own, you just work it as you go.
And then I'm wondering, you said about these traveling professionals, maybe there for a couple of weeks and come out with a buck and a hand. They could actually make a quilt in that time.
They were fast. Ruthie?
I'm really curious about the color red, which definitely is not an Amish color in Amish quilting. And was that due to some predominance of a dye or a
Probably.
commonality of a dye?
That's where I was headed. I was wondering why, what caused that.
Yeah.
Kristin?
It says, I looked this up at one time. It says, wool dyes easily, and it's possible to obtain strength and depth of color. The major natural dyes are indigo for blue, cochineal or madder for reds, with mordants of alum, iron, and tin. And the mordant is the chemical that fixes the dye. But the first synthetic dyes came out around 1856 in Wales, but they would have been expensive early on, and they were slow to reach Wales. So some mills continued to use natural dyes well into the 20th century.
Well, the Indians in this country who were weaving those red dyes and blue dyes came out right about that same time.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what the availabilities were.
Woody?
Can you tell us about the hats?
Well, all I know is that they look like stovepipe. Stovepipe hats to me.
Very striking. I just
Yeah. And the pictures, there's a picture somewhere of them, these women standing all in a row. type hats. I mean, it's what they all wore. Yeah, you can see right here. The men and women wore them. So it was just the national costume and what they wore. You know, and who knows? Because these are in photographs or drawings, they may have been more of a dress-up Sunday dress, and they probably didn't wear them when they were working.
So the hats, so they had curly white things sticking down.
It was, well, that happened around, that was very English. I have my friend Jane who
So I
sent
thought
me,
maybe that was like to tie it under their chin. but
it was a protection thing. You know, they were these little round things, and I have a picture, or I saw a picture of her great-grandmother, and she had these curly white things underneath her cap.
Is it really windy in Wales?
Not really.
Okay. Because I believe it blows gas.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much.